I hope will be an invigorating conversation, and especially to you guys. It's quite a scary number of people here. I'm not quite sure what the expectations are, but I hope I can live up to it. So I better put my specs on to see my notes. I'm always getting this pickle. Age is a terrible thing. So trade-offs and synergies between economic growth and sustainability. And a classic academic move to make at the beginning of this, especially for a group like Pluralist Economics, encourages this kind of move, is to show how it depends. It depends on what we mean by these key terms, sustainability and economic growth. But in this case, I think it's really a practical response as well. It's because it really does matter. What exactly is economic growth? Is it just a single dimension of GDP as measured and structured by the contingently incumbent interests and cultures of our societies, quantified and asserted typically in very hubristic ways by elite experts and their models, just to caricature it a bit? Or is economic growth actually, when one takes it seriously in political economic terms, more about a multiplicity of qualitative relations, different categories, processes that constitute growth? Just like when we talk about in everyday experience about personal growth or growing up, we're talking about growth in an authentic sense of the term, and there's no reason why this should be captured by particular disciplines. So the world certainly needs growth, whatever politics one might have, whatever disciplinary background. It needs growth in values of peace, social justice, ecological integrity. So it really matters what we mean by growth to start with. It also matters what we mean by sustainability. Does sustainability mean, as increasingly, and I'm quite worried about this, I'll come back to it, fear of kind of notionally singular apocalyptic environmental threats, like, for instance, climate change, extinction? Is that what sustainability is about? Subject, typically when we look at these debates, to top-down technocratic control. I remember the slogan, do what the science says. Is that what sustainability is about? Or is it actually about more hope-inspired, not so much fear-driven, hope-inspired, collective action, multiple pathways to realise these values of social equality, environmental integrity, human well-being that lie at the heart of sustainability? So we've really got some big ambiguities. And if we start just taking positions, encouraged by the sort of slight divide, the vibe that you guys have created, if we start taking entrenched positions from the outset, or think we already know what someone else, never mind Richard and I, but others, are going to say, because we're all slipping into this kind of identity politics, and I think we're betraying a responsibility to the importance of these debates. They are really important, and they do matter. So, if we start caricaturing and polarising in the way you said at the beginning, then it's a problem. So, nonetheless, I hope we can still be a bit feisty. But another reason is it's this kind of identity substitutes, this proxy of identity politics, disciplinary identity, political identity, that's actually arguably at the root of the problem I think is fundamental to this whole thing, which is the erosion of democracy, whatever you might mean by that. I'll come back to that, but I think that's underpinning both sides, and I want to kind of step back from the axis that's been set up for us a little bit on that. But but it's a good axis, so let me just try and tackle it. Well, having said all that rather verbosely, if growth is growth in GDP, if that's what economic growth is, as measured by money, official statistics, and the various paraphernalia around that, as structured by prevailing models, markets, institutions, and interests, and so forth, and if sustainability is the full diversity of values I mentioned are codified in the 300 targets, very explicitly, of the SDGs, then I think the issue really is quite obvious. It's got to be, yes, there's massive tension. In fact, I think there's no room for reasonable doubt about that tension. This kind of cult of actually seeing growth as a be-all and end-all and as what is delivered by the statistics is actually really in tension with these more emancipatory values and processes of sustainability. I mean, the idea that societies as presently constituted with consumerism and productivism so central do not need to reduce the magnitudes of those activities really is difficult to contemplate. Without major reductions in global material consumption, and the incentivizing of cooperative redistribution, competitive, and getting rid of competitive accumulation or diminishing the value of that, then the kinds of societies that we're actually going to end up with are going to be a lot nastier, more brutish, and shorter lived than even the ones we're currently in, that we fear about. So at a fundamental level then, I think it's almost trivially obvious that in the long run, in a finite world, that economic growth in itself is incompatible with environmental sustainability. A lot of people have pointed this out really eloquently, and it's actually ironic given the asserted importance of rationality in particular branches, far from all, of economics, the more reductive, aggregative branches of economics, prone to taking numbers at face value as being sufficient. And I know that's not what the Pease group represents. But it's kind of interesting that to treat quantity as if it was independent, quantity is independent from quality, is intrinsically rational. Just as a thought experiment. Before you measure anything, you need a category of what that is. Qualities precede quantities, axiomatically. And so at that kind of level, it's kind of obvious that growth has to be denominated. What we mean by it matters. What do we mean by it? That has to be decided in institutions and practices and cultures that are actually forming even the statistics of GDP. So no matter how expedient it may be then to pretend that something as important as growth, economic growth, is a single thing, it's like a child who really wants a sweet and stamps their feet because they want it. No matter how much we stamp our feet, the idea that growth is a singular thing that can be measured in precise ways is really a romanticism, an expedient romanticism, whatever side that comes from. So that's a bit of a caricature, a straw man, though, because that's the idea that growth, economic growth, is these measures that we happen to have, like the light cast by the lamppost that everyone goes to look for their keys under in the proverb, that's somehow sufficient, that is in itself sufficient, is really an easy thing to caricature. I'm sure Richard wouldn't argue that. So maybe then we should step back and think, well, what about if it's just necessary? If it's a necessary factor in addressing sustainability. And here already a lot of work that's been done by many people counters this, pointing out, for instance, that a lot of activities around, for instance, just to pick up some of the more colourful ones, toxic waste production and management, environmental illnesses of various kinds, weapons of mass destruction, many activities of this kind, actually contribute, the magnitude of the activity contributes to these metrics, and so that all else being equal, the more activity of these radically unsustainable kinds there are, then the more GDP goes up. And so there are tensions of that kind as well. But this is so well explored, I don't think I need to really, I'm probably anticipated by Richard, I don't really want to major on these. The point is that numbers like GDP, and it's not just in economics, it's in other social sciences and indeed in natural sciences as well. The idea that these are shaped like these exist out there in nature as physical quantities is a very seductive allure to it. And it's so alluring, actually, that it tends to be adopted even by the other side of the argument in this case, the critical side. So, for instance, people like Georgios Kallis, Tim Jackson, Kate Raworth, people who I've learned an awful lot from and argue extremely cogently and eloquently on these issues, make the case really well that, in fact, rational economics should not be about following directly values of happiness, well-being, flourishing in society, and not about fixating on some proxy that happens to give us a basis for calculation. They put these arguments really well, but there are difficulties in these degrowth arguments as well, in that they define themselves by the terms of what they oppose. So to oppose growth in a degrowth mode, as some people advocate, is equally problematic in the ways I've said. It assumes that the very thing that you're organising around is equally precise, and you can argue these essentially political contestations over interests and values about particular numbers. So I'm not here to... I owe a huge debt to the degrowth analysis. I think the insights about the problems of material production and consumption developed there like a few other places, but then also it's succumbed in a way to this same unfortunate syndrome of treating what is political as in fact technical. And you can see this, I think, this theory doesn't decide these things, but I don't know if Richard might do this, but going to the theory of value that supposedly is turned to for authority in why it is that we might treat notions of growth, for instance, as singular, that there is this thing called value. And that it is in fact, in principle, makes sense to characterise in a singular fashion. Where does that idea come from? I mean, the theory of value, as I understand it, now people are here much more expert than me, it's kind of slightly ridiculous for me to be making this point here, really, of all places. But they're all the different, whether it be value in terms of exchange value, or labour value, or monetary value, power value, all these different theories of value, they all tend to base on their various ideas on the fact that there is something in principle out there, like Mulder and Scully might say, that we might find, which is singular. But actually, over 200, 300 years of these efforts, it's really been difficult to stabilise any one of these theoretical frameworks such that it convinces protagonists even in the immediate discipline concerned. So the idea then that this fixating around singular calculated quantities can somehow substitute plural deliberated qualities, that's my problem here. And it is eroding democratic politics in the way I say, because it's a strange kind of toxic synergy between academics who gain status, esteem, impact, quite explicitly, from representing things in that way, and political dynamics where one of the most precious commodities in politics is justification. To have a reason why you're intervening in a certain way, especially on contentious issues. So politics doesn't need the justification to be true. As we've seen repeatedly in all kinds of areas, the justification can be false, but if it's confident enough and expressed precisely enough and authoritative enough, then it does the job. And that's where I think the real pressure to represent growth as a singular thing, even though it's manifestly highly plural, where that comes from. So there I'm kind of distancing myself a bit from what the kind of caricatural position I might be expected to take, and I hope I haven't disappointed people. I'm sure we'll have plenty of chances to come out on that in the discussion. But what I strongly support in the degrowth analysis, and what sustainability clearly needs, is massive growth in all kinds of activities that contribute to sustainability. Massive scale of redistributive efforts, health infrastructures, educational investment, social housing, public networks, open source property, collective mobility, cooperative enterprises, community ownership, grassroots innovation, local production, all these kinds of areas need to be grown massively if we're to deliver on the promise of the transformative promise of sustainability. And the fact that those impinge in various ways on the money economy and will be measured in money terms means that they will, in fact, to the extent they grow, contribute to monetary growth, to GDP growth. And it's kind of cutting off the nose to spite the face to say we'll oppose anything that features as monetary growth. So again, it's a tactical kind of reason for concern about simplistic arguments of the kind that we might enter into otherwise. But where these degrowth proponents have it absolutely right is the idea that growth in material production and consumption can be decoupled, from environmental impact. Is again a really romantic idea. I mean, it's so expedient to be able to argue that, but all kinds of processes a lot of people in Sprue work on more closely than me, rebound effects, scarcities of various kinds, diminishing returns of various kinds, the energy inputs and outputs, entropy in recycling, the impacts of services, all these kinds of things entail really important impacts. So the idea that we can decouple economic growth is also problematic in those terms. So, yeah. Why then there is this... I've spent enough time, I think, on the kind of what you could call the narcissism of small differences. And so I want to turn now to the central issue, as I see it, between this conventional, narrow, technocratic, economistic doctrine of growth and this multiplicity of emancipatory values in sustainability. Because that's where the nub of the question really lies, I think. And to argue that growth is somehow needed in order to achieve these ambitious, progressive aims of sustainability is a little bit like a kind of Stockholm syndrome or gangland protection rackets, where those powerful interests that have the privilege of exercising coercive control can insist that anything that's going to be achievable has to be spoken about in terms of their own interests. And I think we're seeing, really, writ large, a hegemony of that kind around growth. But the only way in which to achieve these threatening values, political values, is by actually reinforcing the incumbent status quo. And I think that's where we get the persistence of these kind of ideas. I think I should probably wind up.
You have 2 minutes.
Yeah. So I want to come then at the end to this neglected challenge I mentioned about the forgotten centrality of politics and democratic struggle. Politics is where we argue and are creative and contest the qualities that underline the quantities. It's in political discourse that takes place. It's in the structuring of institutions, the kinds of knowledges produced in expert cultures, that these categories take meaning, which are then variously attempted to be measured in indices like economic growth. And what we get in these terms then, and it was, Lanya remind us of these issues more than anyone else, is how embedded inside cultures and institutions and practices economies actually are. Not just the metrics of growth, but the economies themselves are deeply embedded. And if we really take sustainability seriously, it is about transforming the conditions in which the economy is embedded. So to treat the process of sustainable transformations as if it's subject to the disciplines that come out of those embedded contingent institutions is really getting it completely the wrong way around. And it's actually betraying the promise of sustainability, which is so important. So in the end then, I think this is where I want to introduce democracy. Because to just stay within what I think could be quite stale debates between economic growth on the one hand and environmental sustainability on the other is to miss the ways in which both of those can in fact contribute to the erosion of democracy that I think we see globalizing around the world since the conditions that really remarkable conditions giving rise to what passes for efforts at democracy in the world now. It's not something we can take for granted. It's being eroded in all kinds of ways. And I think this move towards technocratic expertise that we see both on the environmental side, we see sustainability being subverted into that kind of discourse, and we see these more economistic ideas of growth being pushed into that. Both of them are representing that kind of overbearing technocratic hegemony, which is pushing out space for democratic discourse, and which actually, you could also say, is a part of the provocation for the authoritarian populism around the world, where if there's no space for people's own agency, then one wonders what all this is about. And we have these phrases like a plague on all experts coming out in the Brexit context, but I think this is a much more general thing than Brexit. It's nice that Richard's got, I can refer to Brexit. I'm on your side on Brexit, Richard. So it is really serious stuff. And by democracy, I'm not talking about representational procedures. I'm talking about access by the least powerful to the capacities for challenging power. And if we don't attend to that in 1,000 different ways, then we won't see how growth and sustainability are related. And in particular, we'll allow ourselves to be forced into this delusion that these parameters and metrics of growth, or the parameters and metrics of particular environmental problems, are all there is in the world, and there isn't something underlying all that which we should be arguing about. So, thanks a lot.
I think I should just start talking. Before we started, Andy said to me there's actually more things that we agree on than people realize. So let me respond in 2 ways to this and to what you just heard. The first is about degrowth, and I want to say 2 things about this. Degrowth sort of seems like a strange English word, right? It's a neologism. It's a word that is newly invented, but there's actually a proper English word that means exactly the same, and that is shrink. These guys are not advocating for economic degrowth, but they're advocating for economic shrink. And that sounds a lot scarier than that strange word degrowth. And to those people who argue for economic shrink, I say, after you, sir. With regard to democracy and its relationship to environmental policy, I completely agree with Andy. I get very wary when I hear people like John Schellenhuber or Johan Röckström talk about how parliamentarians, before they are elected, should be vetted by a council of academics to see whether they have the right credentials, whether they truly believe in environmental issues. That way Iran lies, right? That is the constitution of Iran, where before you are allowed to enter into politics, you are vetted by a council of guardians. So I get very wary when I hear those things. I also get very wary when people say we have to do this because the science commands it, because the science tells us so. Science never tells us to do anything. Science tells you what would happen if, and how you respond to that is an assessment of the facts plus a value adjustment. If you're on the beach and you see the waters retreating quickly, then science tells you that there's probably a tsunami coming. Science also tells you that if you run for the hills, you increase your chance of survival. But science does not tell you to run for the hills. That is your survival instinct. That is not science. Science will tell you that in most people, the survival instinct is pretty strong. But still, your decision to run is not because the science commands it. It is a value judgment that you make. And we should be very clear about that the science never tells us what to do. It only tells us what would happen, and hopefully with some accuracy, what would happen if we do or don't do certain things. So that in response to what Andy was saying, and I think we by and large agree definitely on the second point. I'm a simple man. I read instructions and then I try to follow them. And the instructions we got given was that we would discuss the controversial and complex relationship between economic growth and sustainability. Can economics still grow and stop climate change at the same time? Or do we need to consider and abandon growth as a policy goal in order to ensure preservation of the environment? When I read that, I wasn't quite sure. And the first thing that struck me was that the environment was immediately narrowed to climate change. I think that is dangerous. I am a professor of the economics of climate change. Most of my knowledge, most of my research is about climate change rather than about other environmental issues. But the environment is much broader than climate change. And there's a great many other things that matter as well. Air pollution kills 6, 7 to 8 million people per year. So our projections for climate change are that it may kill 1 million a year in 100 years' time. Air pollution kills 8 million people this year and next year. That's mostly people in faraway countries. But if you look at such issues as particulate matter, that's also important for the UK. And in parts of the UK, it severely affects health, it severely affects cognition and other things. Plastics are important too, antibiotics are important, pseudohormones are important. So we should never, I think, restrict or narrow environmental concerns to concerns about climate change. There's many other things we may want to worry about. The overarching theme, the relationship between economic growth and sustainability, I agree with Andy that it's a bit stale and perhaps not worth a lot of our time. There are two broad definitions of sustainability, weak definitions of sustainability and strong definitions of sustainability. And weak sustainability is all about maintaining and improving human welfare. And as many people still live in abject poverty, economic growth is a very important part of sustainability. Strong sustainability, or advocates of strong sustainability, cares not so much for people, or not more for people than for other species. Strong sustainability is all about preserving things as they were, or as they are, or perhaps as we imagined that they were 100 years ago. And economic growth is immediate direct conflict with that. So if we want to sort of talk about sustainability and economic growth, depending on where you stand on sustainability, if you advocate a weak definition of sustainability, then the answer is economic growth, yes please. If you're an advocate of strong sustainability, then the opposition on economic growth is absolutely not. And that's essentially the end of the discussion. Sustainability is simply not a particularly helpful prism to look at economic growth, in my opinion. The relationship between economic growth and pressure on the environment is mostly an empirical one. And much has been published on this subject for the last 30 years or so. And this body of literature, which is a very large body, has generated more heat than light. And there's 5 mechanisms at play. And the first one is that a larger economy simply means more pressure on the environment. More resource use, more emissions, more waste. And that's a clear negative from an environmental perspective. The second mechanism is that richer people tend to express more care about the environment, so definitely prepared to do more about environmental care. And if you put the first and the second mechanism together, you immediately realize that the relationship between pressure on the environment and economic growth is an ambiguous one. But there's 3 more mechanisms at play. First is the structure of the economy. As the economy moves from agriculture to industry, it puts more pressure on the environment, but then as the economy moves from industry to services, it puts less pressure on the environment again. So again, we don't learn much in a general way. Technological progress also cuts both ways. If we just consider product by product, then technological progress typically means that products become more efficient, more resource efficient, more energy efficient, emit less, and that's good for the environment. But of course, technological progress also puts all sorts of new technologies on the market that used not to be there, with all sorts of new environmental problems that we haven't encountered before. And one thing that we will see in the coming decade is the chemical waste from photovoltaic panels. Those things are full of heavy metals and full of nasty chemicals. At the moment it doesn't bother us because we just have been putting new ones on roofs. We haven't been taking them down. But as soon as we start taking them down, we have a chemical waste problem. So technological progress cuts both ways. And then the last mechanism, the 5th mechanism, is that richer societies tend to organize themselves in a different way. They tend to be better at certain things and worse at other things. And definitely what we have seen over European history, but also occasionally in Asia and other places, Latin America, is that the democratic movement and environmental concern grow up together. And that in a more democratic society, people are definitely better to express their concerns about what the environment is doing to the health of their children. And we actually see those 2 things reinforcing itself. We also see environmental movements actually stimulating democracy, not just democracy allowing environmental movements to speak. But at the same time, what we see is that in these very mature democracies, they can sort of stagnate because discussions go on forever. And if the Chinese government wants to clean up something, it cleans it up. Whereas the UK government is much less forceful in it. So also democracy cuts both ways. And it is therefore not possible to answer the question whether we should reconsider economic growth for environmental preservation in any other way than it depends. The relationship between these 2 is very complicated. And it depends is often used as a weasel word, particularly by economists, but in this case it does not reflect circumspection. It does not reflect lack of knowledge. As I said, we have a 30-year-old literature on this in economics, and other disciplines may be longer. And that research has concluded that this relationship is simply very complicated and there is no unambiguous result there. But if you ask the world's poor, you would get a very clear answer. May my children grow rich, is what I will tell you. The final question that we were asked is, what time is here? Is whether economies can grow while stopping climate change. Climate change cannot be stopped. It's a natural phenomenon. Human-made climate change can be stopped, but not in a meaningful time scale. If we stop emitting CO2 and other greenhouse gases tomorrow, the climate, or the human-forced part of the climate, will continue to change for thousands of years, right? So we cannot meaningfully say we're going to stop climate change, or human-made climate change. Can economies be decarbonized, go to a zero-carbon economy while growing, is a better question, I think. And there's also a large literature on this, and the answer in that literature is an unambiguous and resounding yes. We can do this. The reason for that is simple. At the moment, renewables are only slightly more expensive than fossil fuels. And the prices of renewables are falling rapidly. Storage of electricity, that's a big problem with wind and solar power, is getting cheaper by the day. And electrified transport is breaking out of its niche markets. Energy is actually not that important in the economy. Sorry, Steve. On a cost basis, it's 2 or 3% of the economy. So even if you were to double the cost of energy, and you would do that gradually, you would not cause significant economic damage. That's simply not possible in an economic model or in an economy that would happen. But we're not talking about doubling the cost of energy if we gradually shift to solar power, which at the moment is 25% more expensive than fossil fuel-based electricity. That will simply not wreck the economy. And that is why so many studies have shown that you can reduce CO2 emissions to zero at the cost of somewhat slower and perhaps immeasurably slower economic growth. Cutting the other greenhouse gases, particularly methane and nitrous oxide, is more complicated, but fortunately they don't have to go to zero. You can maintain positive emissions there while stabilizing atmospheric concentrations. I would like some water, please. What I just said does not imply that climate policy cannot do serious economic damage. It can. But if you look at the climate policies that have been implemented in Europe and the United States and in Japan, they are often easier to explain as exercises in rent seeking than as exercises in emission reduction.